Hey, welcome to Building Data Experiences from the Ground Up. I'm Izzy Miller, a developer relations engineer here at Looker, and today we're going to be talking about not just embedding, but building actual data experiences. And what I mean by that is taking it beyond just a dumb iframe that's embedded on a page, and actually creating dynamic and connected experiences that feel seamless and that take the data and let it power the entire page and interact with the entire page, rather than just be isolated and confined to a little box somewhere on the screen. So we'll walk through building simple embeds and what I mean by simple embedding, and then we'll use the Looker Embed Sdk to create two more complex features that I think are really critical to data experiences and applications, both taking action on an event that we've captured from the embedded iframe in the larger application, and vice versa, taking action within the embedded iframe based on an external event from the application. So, like I said, we're building from the ground up here. And in this case, I mean starting with a blank piece of HTML. This is probably a good time to mention that for the entire duration of this talk, you're going to see code on the left, me over here in the bottom right, and then a browser on top of me that's actually rendering the code that we're writing over on the left. And everything that I'm changing and adding in the code is being rendered directly to the browser panel. This is actual code powering real embeds. And there's some things that I'm not showing here, just little configuration bits and bobs, but you'll have access to all of the code after the talk in samples and this entire repository, so you can revisit even the little bits and bobs that I'm not displaying here. So I'll assume that you're familiar with the basics of HTML, but basically we can just place whatever we want in the body of an HTML page, and it'll show up in the browser. This is my sentimental version of Hello World saying, "Hi, Mom." If we want to embed Looker the easy way, like I mentioned, this is literally all that needs to be done. With just one line, you can add an iframe that contains a Looker dashboard, and this is what we call private embedding. While it's sufficient for some projects, it's fairly basic, and it has one critically limiting factor for many use cases, which is that users must already have a standard named Looker user account to log into in order for private embedding to work. For example, this embed is working here now, but if we head over to the instance that's powering it, and then we log out of the named UI session that's logged in, and then we head back to the embed, you can see that we're no longer authenticated, and no number of reloads are going to bring this session back. The session for the embed was irrevocably tied to that session and that user from the UI. This means that you cannot build an app for true end users using this kind of simple private embedding. And it's really perfect for, say, embedding a dashboard into Salesforce or into your company's intranet or an internal tool of any kind, any case where your users are people that already have Looker accounts and already know about Looker. But for any case where you need to provide access to an unknown number of users, or those users have potentially dynamic or unknown attributes, and you also need them to have a seamless experience without any knowledge or pre-existing knowledge of Looker or pre-existing accounts, then you need to use what we call SSO embedding, or single sign-on embedding. And this is an example of an SSO embed URL. You can see that the structure looks pretty much just like the previous example of a private embed URL. It's just a lot longer and more complicated of a URL. There's a couple interesting things about this. So the first URL that we saw, the simple one, really just contained information about the Looker instance and about the object that we wanted to show, the dashboard ID. And it sort of let the existing Looker session handle all of the authentication and permissions and all of that stuff. That's not the case here. We include those two pieces of information, the instance and the content to embed, but we also include every single piece of information that Looker needs to create a new user and a new session for this embed specifically. You can see we have things like the permissions for the user here defined inline in the URL, along with all of their other attributes. And then we also have a signature parameter here, and this is critical for a couple reasons. It's critical for security because this signature is the contents of the rest of that URL signed with a super secret key that Looker creates that you can use to sign these embed URLs. And then when Looker gets this URL, when you visit it, it checks and says, hey, does this signature match what I expect it to match based on the value of this top secret key? And if it doesn't match, then Looker rejects the URL and doesn't create a user. And this means that only properly authenticated, properly created embed URLs are valid, because otherwise anybody could just create users on your account. That would be very bad. So this is really high security. But the important thing for our purposes here is that we can't really make this URL by hand anymore with the signature. I can't do SHA-256 hashing by hand, and I kind of doubt that anyone listening to this can either. So we need to start creating these URLs dynamically if we want to use Sso embedding. They have to be created by some kind of code. And in this case, we're going to be building them in browser. So we're going to be using JavaScript. And to make our lives a little bit easier, we're going to be using React for the rest of the talk. And I'll assume basic audience familiarity with React. If you're not familiar, this is a complete React app here. There's some configurations and stuff that I'm not showing here, but this is the core logic of an entire React app. I won't dive super deep into it because otherwise this would just turn into a React talk, but basically we're exporting a function here, calling it app, and we can write JavaScript code within that function body, and then in the return of that function, we return HTML that we can sort of interleave with JavaScript from our function. And React handles all kinds of interesting things about state management and making sure that things are rendering properly. So we're going to bring in the Looker Embed Sdk, which is a package that we offer to make it really easy to build these complex URLs and to facilitate communication with them. Because, right, I mentioned that those two really critical components for data experiences are communicating from the iframe up to the application and communicating from the application down to the iframe. So we'll import the Looker Embed Sdk as well as some Looker components. And Looker components are our React UI component library. They're basically just pre-built bits of user interface that you can drop in really easily to make things look a little prettier and be more functional. So you don't need to worry too much about the components provider or anything like that. So I've cheated a little bit and pre-written some of this embed code. We need to create an embed component to render our embed. And so we're using the Looker Embed Sdk here, and this is a pretty simple component. It's about 100, or I think it's about 40 lines of code or so. There's two really critical components to it. The first is this create embed URL as me function. We're creating an embed URL, which in this case is one of those long, complex URLs with all the parameters. And I'm not showing you the authentication of the SDK here, but we've authenticated into the Looker SDK as myself. So we can do this create embed URL as me method, which is going to say, okay, take in this sort of simple iframe URL, that dumb embed URL that I mentioned earlier, and then enrich it with all of my user information to generate one of those long embed URLs with all of my permissions and my attributes and all of that stuff, and sign it with the secret key. So the value returned by this is that signed, sealed Looker embed URL. And then we can take that and pass it into the create dashboard with URL function. And what this does is actually builds the iframe and plops it onto the page. So we can see that we're appending it to the document root. We're giving it a class name, embedded dashboard, so that we can style it and stuff. And then we're building, which in this case is actually the creation of that iframe. And then we're doing something really important, which is connecting. And this opens the communication channels between the embedded iframe and the parent application. And you can do this without the Embed Sdk. It is possible using event listeners and stuff like that in JavaScript, but it can get really complicated, it can turn into a lot of code, and it can be pretty brittle. So this is a really, really important and awesome feature of the Embed Sdk, and we're going to see it working in a little bit. So this little blob of code here, the create dashboard with URL, is what's actually going to render the dashboard embedded. So with this completed function, we should be able to import this component into our main React app and then just render it just like this. And I put it in a box just for layout purposes. We can see, sure enough, we've got our dashboard loading over here, which is awesome. And you might be thinking, whoop-de-doo, this is literally exactly the same dashboard that we just rendered a few minutes ago with one line of code. This is way more complicated. That's true, but remember that the session and the user for this embedded dashboard have been dynamically generated, and they're robust. We could reload this as many times as we want on any browser. You could send this to your great-grandma who's never even heard of Looker, and she could load this page and she would see the exact same thing. She would be authenticated properly, and she would have a user created for her. And that's really powerful, right? That's the kind of thing that you need in order to start building these data experiences and applications for production, where you have an unknown number of constantly changing users. So that's the first piece, right? Creating embeds using the Embed Sdk. And then the second two pieces are regarding communication back and forth between the iframe. So we'll start with the first, which is communicating from the iframe when something happens in the iframe. We want to know about that in the parent application. We want to do something. You might have already guessed based on the title of this dashboard. It's called Drill Menu Click Intercept, but we want to intercept a drill menu click. And in Looker, you can drill into pretty much anything. So here we have a bunch of aggregated data, but we can click on it and open this drill menu, which gives us a couple options for drilling into that data, returning it at higher resolution. But you can also just define custom drill URLs that go to wherever you want. And let's say that we want to, whenever somebody clicks on this install scenarios drill menu, our drill label, we want to do something. We want to open a dialog pop-up in our external application, not even in the embed at all. Maybe we want to make it look different than Looker will let you. Maybe we want to pull in data from a third-party API or add a photo or something like that. There's a zillion reasons why you might want to do this. It's a pretty common use case. We'll look into how we can do it. So let's head back to the embed code that we were working with earlier. And down here in the create dashboard with URL function, we're going to add just one parameter. It's actually not that complicated. We're going to add on. And what on does, it starts listening. So Looker this entire time has been sending out events to whoever's listening. We send out events on drill menu click, on dashboard run, dashboard filters update. Whenever anything happens in the iframe, for the most part, Looker is sending out events about it. We log all of those. But we just weren't listening to them before this. But by adding on, we can start listening to specific events. And here we want to listen for a drill menu click event. And then we want to do something when that happens. We want to handle that click somehow. This isn't a built-in function. We just haven't written it yet. We're about to write it. But for now, all we need to know is that when we click a drill menu, we want to handle that click somehow. So let's write handle click. Pretty simple function, about 10 lines of code or so. And what we can do here is take that event that happens whenever a drill menu item is clicked. We can do a little bit of conditional logic, because remember, we only wanted to open that modal or that dialog when this specific drill label was clicked. So we check and see if it matches install scenarios. And if it doesn't, we don't do anything. But if it does, then we do two things. The first is that we set is open to true, which is just setting the state of is open in the React app to true. And then you can see that the dialog that we're returning down in the lower half of this is just listening to that state. So as soon as we set is open true, the dialog is going to pop itself open. That's the first thing. The second thing that you might not have thought about, but is really important, is that we need to prevent the default behavior from happening, which is whatever would have happened normally when we clicked on that link. Looker, by default, when we click on that link, will just take us to a different page. We don't want that to happen. We want them to stay on our page and see the dialog that pops up. So we return cancel true. And this cancels the default behavior that Looker would have taken. This is really powerful because now we don't have two modals popping up, we don't have a modal popping up and the page changing. We're in complete control of the behavior. We've totally hijacked it from Looker and said, hey, thanks for the event, we'll take it from here. You don't need to do anything. So if we re-render our embed with that updated script that's handling those drill events, we should be able to see that when we attempt to drill on this dashboard now, and we click on install scenarios, yeah, we get a sweet dialog pop up. It's pretty cool. In just a couple of lines of code, we've managed to tackle the first of those two communication mechanisms. We've managed to listen to an event from the iframe and then do something in the parent application based on that input. Pretty cool. So now let's tackle the second thing. We want to now listen to something from the parent application and then take action within the iframe. So this is the opposite of what we just did. It's a little bit more complicated. There's a bunch of different reasons you might want to do this. Just like before, you might want to just have an external button that lets you rerun a dashboard, or maybe a custom filter component that looks different, or that pulls in data from a third party or from your database to change which dates are available. A really useful thing to do would be to just prevent your end users from even selecting a date that you know is unavailable, and you couldn't do that in the standard Looker filter component. So yeah, let's build a dashboard with a date filter, and then let's build an external date filter component for it. We can filter on the date from the parent application and then pass that information down into the iframe. So we're going to cheat just a little bit and import a date range component from Looker components. Like I mentioned, this is our React library of different UI components. Maybe it would be fun to sit here for an hour and watch me build this from scratch, but I don't really think so. So we're going to just import this component, and you could too whenever you want, just with that one line. And we get, with just that one line, a pretty sweet looking date range selector. It's updating itself because that's all baked in, but notice that nothing is changing about the dashboard below. It's not doing anything. So how can we take this component and attach it to the dashboard? Well, we'll go back into the embed script, and where we're returning the input date range component here, you'll see that it has 3 attributes, and 2 of them really aren't very important. They just are concerned with the state of the component and what date range is selected. But the third one, on change, is really important, right? Just like how we wanted to handle click every time we caught that drill menu click, this time we need to handle change every time the date range selected changes. So we got to define handle change. And handle change is sort of a cheat function because it really just calls another function. It just listens for the change event, sets the state of that date range, and then it calls Updatefilters on that date range, which we also need to define. And luckily, Updatefilters is also not too complicated. The majority of this function is actually just doing some date diff math. The first 4 lines or 5 lines are just doing some math on the date range that's selected. This isn't really generic, anything you would need to do for a different filter. But because Looker filters take Looker filter syntax, which you can look up and read about in our docs, we can't just pass it a date range and call it a day. We need to sort of turn it into this string in the last X days format that Looker can understand. So we're just doing a bit of math to build that last X days string. And once we've done that, we can call 2 functions. And we call dashboard.updateFilters. This is a really powerful function that's shipped with the Embed Sdk. It means that we can look up any filter on a dashboard by name. Here we look up created date, and then we just pass it an object, anything that we want, in this case our updated string, and it will dutifully update the dashboard filter with that value. And then the last thing we have to do, which I often forget to do and spend a long time troubleshooting why things aren't updating, is we have to rerun the dashboard, right? We've updated the filters, but that doesn't actually refresh the dashboard and change the data. So we'll call dashboard.run. And what this will let us do, this code that we see over here, just that addition, should connect this date range component to the dashboard below. And we can try it out and see that, sure enough, if we select the new date range here, not only are the filters updating below, but the dashboard is dynamically re-rendering, which is pretty awesome. And that was the second piece of the critical data experience functionality that I mentioned before. We've now gone both ways, communicating from the iframe up and from the parent down. And if you'll remember where we were just about 15 or so minutes ago, we had 4 lines of code and pretty much nothing. We had a blank slate. And in around 15 or 20 minutes, with a total of around 100 lines of very readable code, we could probably do it in less if we wanted to make it less readable, we've created a complete data experience. And it might not be the most beautiful data experience in the world, but it is a functional one, and it incorporates both external components, an embedded data object, and communication with that object and the parent page 2 ways. And I think that those are all of the components you need to call your creation a data experience. I really hope that this has proved instructive in your quests to build similar applications and experiences. You'll get access to all of these samples and this code after the talk, including this entire project, this entire presentation. You can actually clone the repository for it and rerun it whenever you want, change bits about the code, and see how that impacts what's being rendered. You'll also get some code sandbox examples to try out smaller bits of functionality. I hope that this illustrates not just the power of the Looker platform to generate these embedded experiences, but also the power of the tooling that we provide on top of that platform. The things like the Embed Sdk, which let you interface with Looker and build out these applications with really very minimal custom code, really mostly boilerplate things that you were able to import and to really rapidly develop, and not just prototype, but develop for production very rapidly. So make sure to check out the code samples that we're offering after this. Special thanks to Elliot Glasenk for those. He created most of them. And you'll be able to get those other resources as well as the code for this talk in your goodie bag, which is linked to in the community group on the right side of the On24 screen. So make sure to join that community group and get your goodie bag so you can see all of the code from this talk. And before you do that, make sure to answer the poll that's coming right up about which of the Looker platform tools you'd like to learn more about and deep dive into, because we'll be hosting a session later in May diving into one of the 3 tools that you select in the poll right now. Thanks so much.